Welcome to Taking Stock with Lisa Brown. My special guest today is my colleague, Wesley Wood, whose career in wealth management has spanned coast to coast in the United States. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article that poked holes in a widely used retirement formula. And since this is a topic that Wesley has been quoted in nationally and has spoken about publicly, I asked him to join us today to hear his perspectives. And we know that this matters to our busy working professional audience, as you cannot afford to get your retirement calculation wrong. Welcome, Wesley.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Wesley, let's talk about this concept called the 4% rule. Now, in our industry, the 4% rule is like a religious topic to financial planners. So what is the 4% rule, and why did the Wall Street Journal poke holes at it?
So I like to call the 4% rule the most well-known, but also the most misunderstood rule in personal finance. And I think part of the reason that it's so popular, both in our industry and just in financial media, is that it seeks to answer a very fundamental question that every retiree needs to answer. And that question is, how much money can you take out of your portfolio each year in retirement? And if you think about it, if you know the answer to that question, you can get the answers to a lot of other questions that retirees face. You can answer questions like, how much money do you need to have saved up to retire and to keep your current lifestyle? Or you can answer questions like, how many more years do you need to keep working and saving to get to that required nest egg? Or if you're considering different job offers, you can see, which job offer gets you to retirement more quickly. And so, as the name indicates, the 4% rule says you can take out 4% of your portfolio the first year of retirement. You're not taking 4% out every year. You're just taking it out that first year. And then you adjust that amount each year for inflation. So if you have $1 million saved up, you can take out $40,000 first year. And then if inflation's 10%, the following year, you take out $44,000. And you do that every year and for 30 years. And if you follow that rule, you have a very low probability of running out of money. Now, you're basically keeping the same inflation-adjusted lifestyle every year, no matter what the market does. Now, they didn't get the 4% rule just out of thin air. The way they got that 4% number is they looked at every 30-year period in the history of the US stock market. So they looked at the Great Depression. They looked at the housing crisis. They looked at times where we had very high inflation in the 60s or in the 70s. And they saw what was the highest percentage you could take out in all of them and not run out of money. So you're basically hoping for the best, but you're preparing for the worst. Now, this has come under some recent criticism, as you noted, in part because it's been a really challenging market environment for retirees. Inflation's been very high. It's been the highest it's been in decades. The stock market is down, at least so far this year. And bond yields have risen, which is fantastic for retirees over the long term, but they're still pretty far below their historic averages. But I think it's also good to remember that the 4% rule is not based on historic averages. It's based on the worst 30-year period in history. So it should be still pretty conservative for most retirees.
I think, Wesley, one of the important things to keep in mind, too, with the 4% rule is, especially if you have a 10% inflation rate, like you can't have all of your money under your mattress and make that 4% calculation work. And, the 4% rule is a really good back of the envelope, high level target. To your point, it's still a pretty conservative approach, which I love. One of your articles that you wrote on retirement planning, Wesley, you talk about your great grandmother who lived to the age of 97 and just how thankful you are that her advisor was careful in his retirement calculations for her. So since getting this how much is enough equation is so critical, how else should somebody be analyzing whether they're saving enough to retire?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. This is a very, very critical calculation that you want to get right the first time. And life is a lot more nuanced than just a simple rule of thumb. Everybody has a different tax situation, or they're invested in different accounts, or, they have different sources of income. They're not just living on their portfolio. You might have, pension, Social Security, deferred compensation, things like that. And nobody's taking out exactly 4% of their portfolio and spending that same amount every year in retirement and living for exactly 30 years, which is what the 4% rule assumes. My great grandmother, who I mentioned in an article, is a really great example of that. So we're actually not 100% sure how long she lived. And I know that's a really big statement. And part of the reason we don't know is she was a full-blooded Native American, and our tribe didn't even have accurate birth records at the time. She was born in 1920, 1921. And we know that at that time, the average life expectancy in the US was 66 years. And she, lived on a tobacco farm. She smoked every day of her life. She grew up in an area that was relatively impoverished and didn't have great healthcare access. And so I think it would have been really, logical for her advisor to assume that she would live, the average, or maybe a little bit more than the average, but certainly not till 96 or 97. And that's what she ended up living, about 30 years longer than average. And so if you had assumed that she would live closer to that average, she would have spent a lot more money, early in retirement. And I'm sure she would have had a great time. I'm sure she would have gone on some great trips and, spoiled our family a bit. But if she had spent too much too early, she likely would have run out of money at some point in retirement. And then maybe in the second half of retirement, she would have needed to live just on Social Security. And that was a point in her life where healthcare costs rose quite a bit, and that just wouldn't have been sustainable. So, like I said, life isn't 100% predictable. Neither are the markets. We don't know, and nobody knows, exactly what the market's going to do. We don't know what it will return. We don't know what order those returns will occur in. We don't know what inflation will be or what kind of healthcare costs you'll have later in life. And so to account for that uncertainty, one thing we do is we build plans with a lot of nuance and with some conservatism. One tool we use actually allows us to simulate 1,000 potential market environments based on historical returns. So we'll look at different environments that have really good returns. We're also looking at environments that have really bad returns and really high inflation. And we overlay this with your actual financial situation. So how you're actually invested, what is your actual tax situation? What income sources do you have outside of your portfolio? Do you have any big expenses that you want us to account for? Maybe you're not spending that exact 4% every year. Maybe you have a home renovation you want to do this year. Maybe you have an upcoming trip you want us to account for. And so we overlay your personal situation with a lot of nuance from the market inflation side. And it gives us a really good understanding of the financial viability of your retirement.
Wesley, with those expenses not always being the same, to your point, every year, we see that once our clients cross over into that retirement threshold and now their portfolio is their paycheck, we know expenses aren't the same every month, every year, but what do you typically see in terms of the trajectory of people taking more and more out of their portfolio to live on each year?
Yeah, we have a very interesting role where we get to see clients' financial situations before they retire, those first few years of retirement, in the middle of retirement, later in life. And on average, what we see is that our clients' expenses are typically higher the first few years of retirement than they were when they were working. So they're doing all the things they've been putting off while working. They're traveling more, they're golfing more, they're shopping more, maybe spending more time with family. And we call this the go-go years. Then spending typically falls in the middle of retirement. We call that the slow-go years. So they're still traveling, they're still golfing, they're still shopping, but maybe they're golfing twice a week instead of every day. Or maybe they're traveling, but they're traveling domestically instead of internationally. And then later in life, we call it the no-go years. That's typically when healthcare costs rise quite a bit. So basically, you spend a high amount early in retirement, your spending falls a little bit in the middle of retirement, and then it rises again later in retirement due to healthcare costs. If you think about that shape, it's shaped kind of like a smile. It's high at first, low in the middle, high at the end. And we actually call that the retirement spending smile.
which is a great description of, and I like the happy aspect of thinking about the go-go, the slow-go, and the no-go years. But we want our clients to really enjoy those go-go years and as best they can, those slow-go years. And thinking about your grandmother, she had spent too much in those go-go years of hers. It could have been a problem later on in the no-go years and when the healthcare costs were high. So it really is, it's an art and a science for sure. There's no perfect magic formula. And that really leads me into my next point that I'd love for you to talk about is how often should somebody be getting their financial checkup? So we all hopefully are going to the doctor every year for our annual checkup, but what about your financial checkup? I mean, and should that be more frequent when you're retired versus when you're working?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a bit like your your wellness checkup at your doctor. So you want to go at least annually. But I think when you're getting closer to pulling that trigger and transitioning from getting a normal paycheck to living off your portfolio, that's a really big decision. There's a lot of nuance in it, which we've talked about today. And it probably makes sense to look at your financial plan more frequently than annually at that point. I also think if there's been any material change in your financial circumstances, whether that's a new job, maybe it's a new home purchase, maybe there's a change in your healthcare, maybe it's something with the market, maybe it's bear market, maybe it's inflation. I think that's a great time to reach out to your advisor and so just update your financial plan and just make sure you're still on a good track.
Especially that if somebody's a year or two away from retirement, we really try to hone in on what their living expenses are, because we know that is just so critical to get the retirement number right. If you just read a lot of articles in the media, it'll talk about when you retire and you need 70% of what you were living on before. We know that's not really practical unless you immediately pay off your mortgage or something like that when you retire, because the go-go years, you're usually spending as much, if not more, as when you were working. And I like to tell clients that it can take a year or maybe 18 months after you retire to actually figure out what your normal living expenses are. Sometimes we see clients travel for 6 months after they retire. They've got freedom and they're enjoying being out and not having a strict work schedule to stick to. So maybe that first year their vacation expenses are super high, or they buy that new car, or they put the renovation on their house, projects they've been holding off while they were working. So give yourself easily 12 to 18 months into retirement and then reevaluate what your living expenses are and see how that compares to what you were spending before you retired. But I think the bottom line on that checkup is, because life changes, because the markets change, you just want to make sure that your money is always in good shape and that you don't need to have any of those hard conversations later in life about having to cut back or make hard choices. Well, I'd like to thank you, Wesley, for joining me today. Wesley Wood is a wealth advisor at CI Brightworth. And if you'd like to speak with Wesley for a second opinion on your retirement planning, especially getting your retirement number right, give him a call at 404-760-9000. And you can also follow Wesley on LinkedIn. Thank you again for joining us today, and be well.